Let's talk Xenos battlesuits and the deployment of massive plasma fire with an overview of Index Tau Empire in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, and in this video we're going to be doing an overview of the new rules for the army in 10th edition Warhammer 40k, talking through every single rule in their index. In 9th edition I feel like it was very much an addition of two halves for the Tau, very much a challenge prior to their codex, then pretty scary firepower from then, though repeatedly getting nerfs to their crisis suits and commanders did leave them a bit more mid-tier by the end of the edition. It's going to be good to see where they shape up this time around. Overall, I feel like the index maybe is lacking in a few key areas, but does have some really powerful rules, particularly including their For the Greater Good and Kauyon rules, which when combined with really quite a lot of big scary guns, might well just be enough to see them through anyway. In Index Tau, we've got the normal offering for 10th edition indexes. We've got a general army special rule called For the Greater Good. This basically has your Tau army coordinating and using 2 units in pairs to take down enemies. Marker Lights also plays into this now. The detachment rule is the Kauyon detachment. This one's embodying the Patient Hunter and is basically a huge damage buff towards the end of the game, plus 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements, some of which are rather nice. There's then around about 37 datasheets, plus a page of drones as well. One of the biggest and most different shifts to the army is that drones kind of no longer count as models, but are more wargear for the units that they're attached to. In addition to all that, we'll put it together with the points costs, which have come from the Munitorum Field Handbook. Kind of nice that Games Workshop's finally released those now, so we can start to piece together what's looking good and bad for the cost. Starting out then, first up we have the army rule, For the Greater Good. This will be the one that you get regardless of which detachment you're playing with, whenever the Tau Codex eventually comes out and you have multiple different options to choose from. For armies translating into 10th edition, I feel like this is a bigger shake-up than most of them perhaps. Previously this rule had different incarnations. In 8th edition it was more sort of units supporting each other with Overwatch. In 9th edition maybe taking a bit of a backseat compared with the tactical philosophies Montcar and Kauyon, and units getting marker light counters to get +1 to hit. I kind of was expecting a Montcar or Kauyon style rule as perhaps the army wide rule, but it seems they're realising that by detachments rather than this. In general, the main idea is that your units will work in pairs for greater damage. You have 2 units, both of which can see one enemy target. One of them designate themselves as the observer unit and one as the guided unit getting the damage boost. If the unit's being guided towards their targets, their ballistic skill is improved by a +1, so it means that the ballistic skill characteristic of the models will usually change to a 3+, and that is kind of better than a +1 to hit, as it still means that you can stack with other +1s to hit like the heavy keyword. Also, in addition, some units are better at being observers, particularly the ones that have the marker light keyword will also allow you to ignore cover. That's going to be quite a big deal in 10th edition as cover saves are fairly easy to get. It does have some trade-offs though, and means that the guided unit isn't quite as good at splitting fire. For any weapons that the guided unit decides to fire at units other than their targets, then they get a -1 ballistic skill to that. Really quite a massive debuff when you're usually hitting on 4s to start with. Could mean that the guided rule does have a bit of a downside as well. Particularly say for units with one massive gun and a bunch of small arms, they'll probably want to fire the massive gun into a great big target and then the small arms into some light infantry or something. If you're guiding the big gun, the small arms might be a bit less effective. Bear in mind that while all this is going on, the observer unit can still shoot elsewhere, it just doesn't get any buffs and can't be guided, but it doesn't stop the observer unit from doing its damage output. All it's really doing is sacrificing the opportunity of being guided to help out one of your other units. Overall, I think it is really quite a powerful rule. Going from ballistic skill 4+ to 3+ is big, particularly for really massive units in your army. I think it'll give you some incentive to have some units that just have a bit lower firepower running around. Maybe transports like Devilfish could be a good option for spotting for targets with bigger guns, or maybe things like individual piranhas. Otherwise, it kind of incentivizes you to have units that are dedicated to going into one target and not splitting fire too much. And I would bear in mind that while it is the faction special rule, not every single unit has it on their datasheet. For example, Kroot units do not, kind of similar to how they didn't really use marker lights before. Next up, we've got the launch detachment, which is called the Kauyon detachment. This one's embodying the Patient Hunter. And I do think it's a little bit on the weird side that this is the launch detachment that is supposed to be a bit more of a balanced one. It's just perhaps a little bit odd, being basically half of the Tau tactical philosophy along with Montcar. Seems that if you want to play a high progressive style Tau list, that's going to have to wait till the Codex. In the meantime, I guess you can exemplify Kauyon and be patient. In the detachment, you get a powerful damage boost special rule, but there's also a few restrictions on units that you can field. Basically, as with the Farsight Enclaves, you can't include both Farsight and the Ethereals in the same army. You have to choose either Mr. Farsight or them. I think both of them do have their advantages. The base Ethereal can farm command points quite well. The Farsight genuinely is quite scary and can weirdly enough make use of the tank shock stratagem quite well. Otherwise though, it does look like any sort of Sept or Enclave restrictions have been dropped. Looks like you can mix Shadowsun, Farsight and Ornshee all in one list if you'd like to. As with the vast majority of armies in 40k, it doesn't look like there's any restrictions between sub-factions. That seems to be just for the Space Marine chapters now. Getting onto the big damage boost rule itself though, it perhaps isn't too enormously different from the 9th edition Tau rule. Kauyon gives you a damage boost all the way from turn 3, though it doesn't get any stronger towards the very end of the game now, it just gets pretty strong on turn 3 and stays that way. The rule is that all units get sustained hits 1, usually going to be a big 33% damage boost there if you are hitting on a 4+, and then it gets even better for guided units, that gets you sustained hits 2, so 2 additional hits on 6s, usually a plus 50% damage increase compared with a guided unit on battle round 1 or 2. That is a pretty monumental damage increase considering that they were pretty dangerous already. 6s to hit are going to be kind of brutal. Overall I think it's definitely an interesting one. The damage boost is very strong and Tau armies suddenly get massively dangerous from turn 3 onwards. I feel like it might play kind of similar to 9th edition White Scar Space Marines, a big incentive to try and keep at least a fair few of your most dangerous units back until turn 3 and then absolutely go to town on the enemy army with a big alpha strike after that. Could probably use a bit of strategic reserves or deep strike to help with that maybe, or just hide some units behind terrain. It is going to be a bit of a balance though, as you can't afford to completely abandon objectives and do no damage in the first few turns, so it kind of feels like something that you'd have to judge pretty carefully against your opponent. On the flip side though, I feel like most Tau lists probably aren't going to be able to afford to just rush their opponent with a whole load of scary units. Generally that's just not going to work out quite as well compared with utilising the rule to the maximum. Next up, let's talk stratagems, and the Kauyon detachment has 6. First up, for 1 command point, there's Stim Injectors. This one's a reactive 6+ feel no pain for any Battlesuit unit. Most of the time what's a Battlesuit and what isn't is fairly clear. The Riptide and Ghost Kill are. The Storm Surge still counts as a big walking battleship Titanic vehicle. A 6+ feel no pain isn't bad, but it's still not enormous. Usually it's a 20% durability increase against enemies' attacks, particularly relevant for big multi-wound units. Could be handy enough for crisis teams as well, particularly if they get attacked by flat 4 damage attacks from somewhere. Means that you could really break the enemy unit's efficiency from killing them like that. 1 failed shot is likely to have at least 1 feel no pain saved against it, so you might well be getting 2 shots to down each suit. Overall I'd say it's alright and usable, though not enormously standout. For 2 command points we've got Strike and Fade. This one's basically the Tau classic move shoot move. Select a Tau battlesuit unit that can fly, and then you can make a normal move after it's shot. You can get some big movement out of crisis suit units out of this, potentially 20 inches in a turn, potentially even more if you've got a cold star battlesuit. You could have them going really quite a long distance and then going back and trying to stay safe. It's going to be a little bit harder to coordinate now that the fly keyword doesn't interact quite as well with ruins and things. Battlesuits can't just ghost through them as they're not infantry anymore. So if you want to move, shoot, and then get hidden again, it'd be more going around the edges of ruins rather than directly over them. 2 CP is pricey, but still shooting and not being shot is absolutely massive, so could definitely be worth it on a big unit. Next for 1 CP we've got Coordinate to Engage. This one is a +1 to hit boost for your Observer unit as well as the Guided unit, and they also ignore cover as well if they have a marker light. Definitely not terrible, though probably a little bit on the situational side. Kind of ideal if you just had some small units to mark targets for your bigger units, rather than having to use 2 big units to support each other. Also, out of the 2 units that you have to pick, you'll usually choose the best one to be the guided unit anyway, so you will be getting this on the second best one. But still for 1 CP, +1 to hit and ignores cover could well be worth it to the unit's firepower, particularly if it's a fairly big unit that you're boosting and it's going into an enemy unit with cover. For 1 CP, we've got Point Blank Ambush. This one gives you an extra AP -1 within 9 inches, and unfortunately this one does tie into the Kauyon restrictions, so you can only use this during battle round 3+. I feel like between those two it's going to be a little bit of a niche stratagem perhaps. You can't use it out of Deep Strike normally, as you have to be within 9. But it is another very useful tool that you can use to make the counter attack from turn 3 onwards, I guess. You've got the massive damage output from Kauyon, and then combine it with this to repel enemy units that have been attacking your deployment zone. I feel like this will situationally be really quite a useful one, particularly on turn 3. Perhaps doesn't really feel one that you really plan around too much though. Just when it falls right, it could be absolutely brutal along with Kauyon boosts. Next up, Photon Grenades makes a return. This one impacts grenades units, so it can't be used on battlesuits and things, but gives you a -2 to charge against Tau infantry, and also throws them a battle shock test for good measure. The -2 to charge can be really quite big if your opponent's trying to make something like a fairly reliable 7-inch charge, much less good on a 9, and particularly nice for any deep strike charges your opponent might be trying. Going up to an 11-inch on that is absolutely brutal and not likely to happen at all. I feel like the battle shock test is kind of fun as well. If they fail it, then they could potentially not be able to command point reroll the charge, which again would be very nice. Plus, because it's actually happening in your turn as opposed to your opponent's turn, there's a chance it might actually matter for things like objectives, which often handed out battle shock tests don't really. Overall, a decent stratagem, again somewhat situational, but every time it does actually manage to prevent a melee from happening, that's generally going to be a good thing for the Tau player and more than worth 1 CP. Finally, one last 1 command point one is Combat Embarkation. This one's a powerful one, but also a kind of niche one. It literally just affects infantry units jumping in and out of Devilfish, and it's a countercharge stratagem there. If your opponent tries to charge a unit that's next to a Devilfish within embarkation range, you immediately get to get back in that transport, hopefully keeping your unit safe from damage this turn, though your opponent could redeclare the target of the charge, potentially targeting the tank if they wanted to. I guess it could also be used to mess around with those tidewall fortifications if you'd like to. They also have the transport tag. I feel like this is a nice disruptive but situational one. Very nice if you're just about to have breaches that get wiped out by enemy combat, and if it ever comes up, it seems like a pretty reasonable way to keep a scary unit alive for one more turn. I just feel that when you've only got 6 stratagems though, this one just really doesn't apply to the vast majority of the army. You might not even necessarily be using transports and infantry units, so a bit of a dodge stratagem against many lists, and also plenty of armies that just use range fire to gun down your fire warriors and aren't going to bother charging them. Overall, for stratagem sets in 10th edition, I feel like it's not one of the stronger ones really. Strike and Fade for the move shoot move is very nice. I feel like the rest of them though are just kind of reliably okay, or situationally potentially good. Besides the jump shoot jump one, I feel like there's just a little bit less opportunity for ones to spam every turn. I guess Tau armies might be making a bit of heavier use of Overwatch though with all their shooting units. Then we've got 4 enhancements, and I feel like a couple of these are very good. First up for 15 points, we've got Exemplar of Kauyon. This one's 15 points, and this one gets you early Kauyon on your unit. He gets to get those nice sustained hits from Battle Round 2. For 15 points, this is really excellent. You get to have that enormous damage right earlier in the game, and if you're going to put this into a big crisis block or something like that, then you're certainly going to want to guide them. Sustained hits too on a massive great big unit with lots of shots. Between that and the +1 to hits, you'll typically be averaging as many hits as you have shots, which is very reliable indeed. You could even think about keeping the unit safe by putting them in deep strike and then jumping them down on turn 2. Bar Overwatch, that basically guarantees your damage then. Otherwise, we've got Precision of the Patient Hunter, that's 20 points, +1 to hit for commanders, they now hit on a 3+ in general, and then doubling down on damage boosting Kauyon once more, +1 to wound from battle round 3 onwards. Overall, I'd say it's fine for 20 points. Tau commanders can sport 4 different scary guns, so it's certainly not useless in the early game. The +1 to wound really does seem like the valuable bit though, and again triggers when Kauyon does. Next up, we've got the Puretide Engram Neurochip for 25 points. This allows the bearer's units to be targeted by a stratagem that's already been used on a different unit this phase. Though actually still needs to pay for the extra command point for this stratagem, I feel like maybe it's just a little bit on the limited side. I guess you could potentially have 2 units jump shoot jumping if it really made sense to spend all that command points, and if you even had it. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it would work on Overwatch, as that one's limited to just 1 use per turn within the text of the stratagem, so I don't think that the Puretide chip would get around that. Overall, I'm just not super enthused at that at 25 points. I feel like if it was cheaper it might be interesting utility, just hard to see an obvious stratagem that you'd always want to spam. Finally, we've got you through Unity Devastation for 20 points. This one I think is very nice indeed. If this unit observes, then it can grant the guided unit lethal hits, in addition to the regular boost that it gets, probably +1 to hit, and ignores cover. Tau do have a whole load of fairly scary shooting units, a lot of them have a lot of lighter shots as well, and getting one of your Tau units to have lethal hits as well is quite a nice way of amping up that scary damage. I guess the main question would be where to put this. I suppose it's either going to be jumping around with a Tau commander, and then maybe using that 1 command point stratagem to make sure they're guided as well. Or suppose you could potentially use it on perhaps a card of Fireblade leading some Fire Warriors. Could be okay to be using them as backfield infantry to help spot for your other more dangerous Battlesuits. Overall, out of the enhancements, I feel like that one is one of my favourite, along with the Exemplar of Kauyon and maybe Precision of the Hunter after that. I'd say Exemplar of Kauyon probably has the biggest value out of any of them though. 15 points for an enormous damage boost turn 2 is really good, getting that damage in earlier in the game than you normally could. Overall, I feel like it's a bit of an interesting launch detachment. Definitely encourages players to basically play cagey and then strike hard. I feel like perhaps the majority of Tau powers coming from the greater good rule plus the detachment rule. The stratagems are okay, but I feel like a couple of the enhancements are quite good value. Then for the rest of the units, we're into the datasheets. In Index Tau, the battle line units have been shifted around slightly. We've just got the strike team and the breacher team. Looks like the Kroot carnivores have lost any sort of battle line status. They don't count as troops, and unless you lead them with Ornshi, they don't even have objective control 2 either. A bit of a shame that one. I feel like maybe they could have done something similar to the Tempestus Scions. Then if you had a Shaper Warlord, you could have made Kroot battle line perhaps. I guess they still don't really quite have enough models to properly fill out an entire army though. Not unless it's a pretty small one, so it might have been a bit weird having a Kroot Shaper in charge of some Tau. Otherwise, at least compared with a few indexes, the changes have been somewhat minimal. There's one new datasheet in the book, which is the Kroot Farstalkers. They'd been a digital download and now are rolled into the core rules. They're the Kroot's bounty hunter kill team with some special weapons, but otherwise perhaps a few of the slightly more peripheral datasheets like Longstrike, Tide Walls, and Ornshi, all of those are still there, even the ones that got range rotators. The only datasheet that's been lost is the Crisis Bodyguard datasheet, it would seem. Previously, they were just a different way to run your crisis suits, had some better character protection rules, plus had slightly different Wargear variations. I guess with them gone, it does limit maximal crisis spam just a little bit. If you take 3 maxed out units though, you can still have 18 crisis suits on the board, plus commanders. As it goes, a little bit of loss of flexibility, but maybe not the biggest one in the world. Otherwise, a few datasheets have seen some rather major shake-ups, probably the single biggest ones being to drones. As seen before in Games Workshop's previews, they're basically no longer counting as models in your army, but instead count as wargear choices, either adding in the marker-like keyword, extra weapons, or an extra wound in the case of the shield drone. It does mean that in effect a lot of Tau armies will have lost quite a lot of models, and with that way a lot less durability on certain units. With that, drones are quite handy for tanking big hits. It feels like drones really are just being more emphasised as bits of war gear that don't really do that much otherwise. Mechanics like drone controllers, saviour protocols, and drone disembarking all seem to be completely gone. And you can still field a squad of tactical drones if you want to. They're limited to gun drones and are objective control 0 and far too many points as well, so they're really discouraged. Otherwise, the base leadership for the army is leadership 7, so they are going to be more susceptible to battle shock than quite a few armies. How big a deal that'll be will be a little bit more questionable. It does kind of rely on your units being injured but not destroyed, and you can counter it a bit with insane bravery where it matters. The other really big shift though is that battlesuits are now vehicles rather than infantry, even the smaller ones like crisis suits. It looks like it's just the stealth suits that count as infantry now, and the regular crisis suits and broadsides and things, they're now vehicles. That brings with it a few positives and negatives. They'll certainly interact a lot worse with terrain than they did before, and it does combine kind of horribly with the new fly rules, basically meaning that they'll have to measure up and over if they want to go over, say, a ruin now, rather than being able to basically go straight through. It is kind of handy for an engagement range though. Generally it means that the crisis suits will still be able to fire a pretty decent effect even in melee. They'll be able to target units even that aren't trying to lock them up in combat, though they will take a -1 to hit penalty. Kind of weird that it also means that they can tank shock at this point as well. Still not 100% sure if Games Workshop really intended that to be a thing for vehicles, but certainly Commander Farsight can tank shock very hard indeed if he wants to. Finally, before we jump into datasheets, I thought we'd just take a look at a few of the common Wargear drones. As per the new point system, all Wargear is free, so you basically get 2 of these with every single model that can take 2. But now they're not individual units that can tank hits, that is a little bit less exciting. Most of the units tend to have the access to the 3 standard ones, marker, shield and gun. Shield drones have been toned down really quite a lot though. They just add 1 to the wounds characteristic of the model that they're attached to. They don't give you any sort of invulnerable save anymore, and they don't tank entire hits. I guess they could be useful enough for just inflating the wound value of things like crisis suits. Having them go up to wounds 5 could be quite nice against damage 2 weapons. They don't seem like the choice that you want though for lighter infantry characters. Marker drones now simply give you the marker keyword, and they also allow you to advance and observe if desired. I feel like these will get used quite a bit. Having just one of them to have the marker keyword in the unit seems like quite a good idea. Cover saves are definitely going to be a fairly big thing in 10th. Otherwise, gun drones will just allow you to spam a fair bit of extra pulse carbine shot towards the enemies. They retain their fairly poor ballistic skill of 5+, and only get the 2 shots now, though those 2 shots are twin linked and they do have assault as well. Twin links does mean that any hits that you do get should have a pretty decent chance of wounding, and just stacking a few more AP0 saves on their target, not too bad against light infantry. They do basically count as a weapon that the model is equipped with now though, so it will mean that they will get the +1 ballistic skill for things like guided fire, so you could have them hitting on 4s with that. Overall, out of the standard ones, I feel like I'd be most tempted with maybe just one marker drone in each unit, perhaps gun drones beyond that for lighter infantry, and then weighing up between guns and shields for heavier things like suits. Finally, we also have the missile drone as well, which is the broadside and the riptides one. The riptide just counts as regular missiles now. They're actually really quite a lot more punchy, and I feel like they're very tempting for those units. 2 shots at ballistic skill 5 plus, strength 7, AP minus 2, and damage 2. Weirdly, they seem to get a missile pod that's more dangerous than other missile pods in the army. I feel like that kind of damage profile probably trumps the rest of the drones for the most part. I'd take them when you can. Finally, for drones, there is a sentence at the start of this entire section that says that if you upgraded models with a drone, then just place them by your models as a token reminder. They don't count as a model for any rules purposes, so I guess you can't draw line of sight to or from them, and they can't really get in the way of enemy charges or anything like that. Like a few slightly more peripheral things in units, they just seem to literally be pretty much tokens now, as opposed to models in their own right. Getting into the datasheets proper though, let's start with infantry units and the battle line ones, then we'll talk about tactical drones and move on to our various flavours of battlesuits. First up, we've got the Fire Warrior Strike Team, 10 models for 100 points, costs a fair bit more than the 80 that they did before, but gear is included now. They get to pick up 2 drones from the list of standard ones plus the Guardian drone, and I feel like compared with the other ones that are on offer, the Guardian drone is basically auto-include. It's a -1 to wound for the bearer's unit against ranged attacks, so you could have bolters wounding them on 4s, and even weirdly things like las cannons only wounding them on 3s, all very nice. Otherwise, perhaps a gun drone beyond that. The unit's already got the marker-like keyword at base. Otherwise, their stats really aren't changed all that much. They do get objective control too. Generally, weapons in 40k have lost a fair bit of AP going into 10th edition. That's common across really quite a lot of Tau guns. The pulse rifle has lost AP and range, the pulse carbine has lost range and the assault keyword, and the support turret has gone a kind of strange profile. 2 shots hitting on a 5 plus at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1, with the indirect fire keyword and also twin links. It can only attack with that if the units remain stationary for a turn. I guess that represents them setting up their turret and firing away with a few pot shots. Looks like there's no option for that for a missile pod or anything now. It basically is a mini smart missile launcher. Overall, with AP 0, they're not really going to threaten most things bar light infantry all that much. I guess at this point's cost, they're probably not likely to be any sorts of primary damage dealers. Maybe it could be a good retinue for a fireblade or something. Their special rule is to allow them to overwatch on a 4+. That does seem reasonable enough for one command point, to be honest. Could get some fairly reliable anti-infantry hits to hopefully gun down some light infantry before the enemy takes down yours. The other squad of Fire Warriors is the Breacher team, and now these guys are significantly more expensive than the Strikes. They're all the way up to 115 points. Feels like a bit of a premium for these guys. Again though, they do get that very nice Guardian drone included for free, so at least their durability went up a little. Their gun's the Pulse Blaster, and this one is just one consolidated profile now. 2 shots at strength 6, AP -1, damage 1. Pretty brutal if you can get it in range. And these guys have got a seriously punchy damage dealing wound roll, where if they get to target an enemy unit or an objective, you get to re-roll the wound roll with all of those fairly solid shots. It does seem that they're really just specialised towards their role now. Have a squad of them in a devilfish, swoop onto an objective without objective control, light up enemy units that happen to be there already, and then hopefully try and hold out against the enemy when it comes to their turn. A little bit more defense now with the Guardian drone, though they do cost quite a bit more. Otherwise, for the Tau infantry, we've got the Pathfinder team. These guys are 10 models and are 120 points. I feel like if you're directly comparing against the Strikes and the Breachers, they do look kind of interesting, mainly just because of the fairly potent special weapons that they can take. For their base rules, they still scout. Their stats have gained a 4+ save up from the 5+, so are a little bit more armoured than they were before. They mainly get the pulse carbines and still have a marker light rule where they can observe for 2 different units. I feel like perhaps the most exciting things that they have though are their spam special weapons. The unit can take 3 of either different type. The new ion rifle profile is strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 with 3 shots, just with a single hazardous keyword now. Quite a nice generalist profile that, and the rail rifle just gets the 1 shot still, but this one's been upgraded to strength 10, AP 4, damage 3 and devastating wounds. Both of those are a lot more threatening than your standard pulse carbine. In the squad as well, you also get a free grenade launcher too. Again, this one's a fairly solid upgrade, either an EMP shot that can give you anti-vehicle and devastating wounds, or a fusion shot with strength 6, AP -1 and damage 3. Quite a nice low AP but scary shot. Every so often that could splatter Terminator perhaps. Finally, for their drones, they get the choice of 3 different ones. The Grav Inhibitor drone is just a permanent -2 to charges. You can't stack it with photon grenades though. The Pulse Accelerator drone gives a +6-inch range to their pulse carbines, a little bit more long-range threats, though I'd say they're not the most big focus of the unit. And then if you do want to have these deploying in the midfield somewhere, you can take the Recon drone. This one comes with a burst cannon profile hitting on a 5+, but also allows them to infiltrate as well, so you could set them up a little bit further forward if you wanted. Overall, I think they look like an interesting enough unit. Perhaps kind of weird that I feel like a lot more of their value comes from the special weapons now. Really not too bad damage output, though again they're still not going to be all that hard to kill due to being infantry with 4+ saves. Next up we've got the tactical drones, which are 4 to 12 models. For some reason these guys are 70, 140 or 210 points, so just absolutely ridiculously pricey for what they do. The tactical drones got a lot less exciting on a number of different levels. They're all gun drones now, so you can't take markers or shields. Their movement went down a little bit to movement 8, they lost some toughness to go to toughness 3, and their objective control 0, so you can't even hold points with them. They can deep strike, but if you want to deep strike them you should probably use Vespids. These things don't even have that for the greater good rule, so they can't even spot for other units. I don't know if GW just wanted an on-paper way to allow you to still field drones in some way. I feel like the points cost is probably about double where it really needs to be. On to more exciting stuff though, and certainly Crisis Battlesuits have a lot to talk about. One of the key units in the army and have a crazy amount of different weapons and options. Crisis suits come in 3 to 6 models now, 195 points or 390. Overall, after accounting for Wargear and things, that'll usually be a bit cheaper than they were before. Their stat lines are broadly unchanged, besides the change from being infantry to vehicles, which as mentioned makes them not really quite as much a fan of terrain, having to go round things like ruined walls or over, and they can now both shoot and be shot in combat. They still have very flexible weapon and wargear choices, 4 choices total, and 3 of those can be ranged weapons. You can duplicate any of them just about as much as you want to now. The only exception to that is the airbursting fragmentation projectors. They're a maximum of 1 per model, though admittedly I don't think that they're really all that strong. They now basically have 3 different support systems, either the Battlesuit support system, shield generator, or weapon support system. Every suit would get one of those for free as its 4th hardpoint, otherwise if you want 2 of them you'd have to give up one of your 3 free weapons. Finally, for each suit you can also take 2 drones out of the standard list of the normal 3. I feel like a mix of shield, gun and marker could be pretty reasonable for these guys, though not having drones to tank random shots I think is going to make the unit a lot less durable just overall. Getting into the actual guns, and most of the units have been toned down in one way or another. Some of it just 10th edition AP changes I suppose, but a few of them do just feel flat kind of nerfed. The plasma rifle loses a bit of range and a bit of AP, still fairly general purpose though. The flamer has fewer shots, it's now just D6 rather than D6 plus 2, it did gain ignore cover though. Fusion blasters gained a little bit of strength, but now will be wounding vehicles on a 5+ for the most part, rather than a 4. That one's lost 6-inch range as well, so it's definitely a lot harder to get into melter range for. I'd say at least on paper probably the most exciting weapon is now the Cyclic Ion Blaster, which you can spam 3 of on every suit if you wanted to. Potentially 9 shots at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2 is fairly scary out of each individual crisis. If you overcharge them though, then genuinely you are risking some serious damage to the suits now. Every individual Cyclic Ion Blaster will mean that you have to roll on the hazardous table, and for each roll of a 1 you take 3 mortal wounds. 3 suits with maximal cyclics do seem to have a fairly serious chance of killing one of their models with their own shooting. The airbursting fragmentation projector still fires D6 shots out of line of sight. That's lost both AP and its strength 3 though now. With the indirect fire penalties, that's just really not going to do all that much. You'd average around about 1 strength 3 hit per model, and your opponent will get the benefit of cover against that. Otherwise, the burst cannon has lost a couple of shots, back down to 4 shots again, and the missile pod has lost an AP pip. Still fairly general purpose though, and slightly longer range than the rest, 30 inches, strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2. Overall, between all that, they're definitely going to be a fair bit less dangerous. It does seem pretty interesting that you can spam 3 of the same weapon type though, it could make a lot more focused units. Finally, for the support systems they can take, you can have the shield generator for a 4+ invulnerable save. That seems like a very good idea given that they don't have as many tanking drones now. Otherwise you have the choice of something called a Battlesuit support system, which allows the individual model to fall back and shoot. Definitely nicely flexible. I suppose that could be interesting enough on a suit unit that you think is going forward very aggressively. As vehicles you could still fire in combat though. And then maybe a bit more of a general purpose ranged one is the weapon support system. This one allows you to ignore the hit roll modifiers when you make a ranged attack, so it could be helpful against, say, enemies with stealth. Out of the three, though, I still think that the shield generator would probably be my first pick. I guess perhaps the weapon support one might be kind of interesting on a suit unit that you know that you're going to try and keep safe with jump, shoot, jump. Finally, we actually have the Crisis Suit's unique special rule, which is called Turbojets. This one allows them to auto-advance 6 inches, which isn't going to be quite as relevant for them anymore, seeing as their weapons lost the assault keyword. I guess not unhelpful if they do need to reposition for a turn when they have literally nothing to shoot. In general though, I feel like this one's going to be most useful if your squad's led by a cold star battlesuit, which can give you that assault keyword on your weapons, potentially a fairly scary threat range, 16-inch movement and then shooting to full effect. Overall I think they still will be interesting. The unit's power does seem like it's been downgraded a fair bit, but also it has got a bit cheaper in points too. Hopefully it's still at the level where it's kind of viable. They're probably still going to be important to some extent. Move shoot moving them is very powerful, plus they're kind of necessary as a retinue for the Crisis Commanders if you're running those now. Otherwise we've got their cousins with bigger badder guns, the broadsides. These can be fielded in squad sizes of 1 to 3, 110 points each, and stat wise kind of similar besides being vehicles and gaining 1 extra pip of toughness. They're toughness 6 now, not 5. Perhaps a little bit unfortunate they won't be able to gain terrain rules quite as easily, though I suppose you could still have them just on the edges of ruins and things, and just hiding a little bit of the model behind a part of a line of sight blocking thing. That way you could still get the +1 save on their 2+ armor. Their special rule is a bit of a weird one, but will be nice when it comes up. A 4+ save against mortal wounds. Not really the sort of rule that I would have expected for the broadside battlesuits, but I guess that'll be a bit of extra protection if the opponent shoots at them with something with devastating. Their primary guns, either the heavy rail rifles or the high yield missile pods. The heavy rail rifles look quite nice I think. 2 shots at strength 12, AP 4 and damage d6 +1. They've got the heavy keyword, so if you're static then you hit on 3s anyway, potentially hitting on 2s if you get the unit guided as well. They also do have devastating wounds, so a big 6 could be pretty nice. Looks like very solid anti-tank overall. The high yield missile pods are 30-inch range, strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2, but have picked up twin linked. I feel like with that profile they're probably looking a little bit more interesting than they were before. They'll definitely stack a fair bit of saves on your opponents, no matter what you're shooting at. Not sure if they quite compete with those massive anti-tank shots though. Then for their hard points, I think they'll still want to either take the plasma rifle or the smart missile system. The plasma rifle perhaps seems like the most likely one to be useful. A strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 shot with twin links. Smart missile systems really look like they have been reduced quite a bit in this new Tau index. Even the twin one only gets 3 attacks hitting on a 4+, strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1, but they do have the twin linked rule. If they do fire out of line of sight, then that would just be averaging 1 single indirect fire hit with a strength 5 and re-rolling wounds. Indirect fire is definitely nice to have, but I just feel like that's just too weak to really add up to much. Otherwise, beyond that, they'll have the option of the battlesuit or weapon support systems, the same ones as the crisis suits can have. The weapon one being quite nice to allow that rail rifle to ignore modifiers maybe. Otherwise, you could instead boost your Alpha Strike with a single Seeker missile, a single big shot at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6 +1. That seems very in tune with what the heavy rail rifle wants to do. Overall, I feel like they look like really quite a solid focus unit, really quite nice anti-armor for the Tau Empire, and they also get their choice of drones as well. I feel like the best value out of those would probably be the missile drones with the extra shots at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2. They could genuinely be a slightly meaningful increase to firepower. Next up, we've got the Riptide that's now 235 points, so slightly more than 2 broadsides. I feel like the Riptide has maybe got a bit less exciting overall on most levels though. It's gained toughness 9 and still has a lot of wounds and a good invulnerable save, but again like the crisis suits its weapons have been toned down and it hasn't really even gone down in points all that much. Perhaps more importantly as well, the Nova Charge from going from something that was really quite meaningful is now a bit less so. It's just turned into a once per game devastating wounds for your primary weapon. Definitely not bad to have, but just realistically not going to add up to all that much when it just happens on one turn. You have a very reasonable chance of just rolling no 6s whatsoever. For its main weapons, you have the choice between the Iron Accelerator and the Heavy Burst Cannon. I feel out of the two, the Iron Accelerator is probably still the one to go for. 6 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 4. I think that probably beats out 12 at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2. The Ion is a lot less interesting against tanks and vehicles now though. It went from wounding most things on a 4 or 3 to wounding most vehicles on a 5. Otherwise, the secondary weapon systems have all got the nerfs that are in line with the crisis suits, and on top of that these ones went from having double the shots to just twin links, definitely worse overall, particularly against things that they were wounding on a 3+ or better. It does get the support system keywords thrown in though. It does get to ignore modifiers and fall back and shoot, so I guess that's two extra helpful things to have there. Overall, I must admit for 235 points doesn't look enormously exciting. Not too bad defensive stats with the 4 plus invulnerable, but I think it's going to hurt not being anywhere near as much a general purpose threat against heavy tough vehicles. Stealth battlesuits next, and first up we have the small ones, 3 to 6 models here, and are either 75 points or 150 for a squad of 6. Their costs unchanged, but I guess they went down a little bit due to getting free Wargear. The stealth suits can still forward deploy with infiltrators, and they also have the stealth keyword as well. They lost their extra special rule where they get their bonus to the saving cover though I guess they can still get the benefit of cover for being in ruins quite easily as their infantry. It will mean that they can interact with terrain a lot better than crisis suits can as well. For the weapons, the burst cannons have been toned down a bit, 4 shots not 6. You can take 2 drones and you can take duplicates, that's kind of handy to have thrown in. Probably worth having a marker drone in there, seeing as they seem to be really quite well suited for marking units and being observers. They've got an interesting homing beacon special rule, which means that crisis suits could potentially use rapid ingress to come in near them. I guess could be interesting for getting things like fusion blasters within melter range. In general, not as big a deal for crisis teams as things that want to charge out of melee, but I suppose it could be interesting for Commander Farsight as well if he wanted to get into combat with reliability. Weirdly though, it doesn't look like they have a clear way to say which model in the squad gets the homing beacon. It's listed as Wargear, but there's no clear way to equip it. Seems kind of obvious that the intent is for one of them to have it though, and it probably wouldn't trade out with other options. Otherwise, one of them per 3 can get a battlesuit support system, so that one could fall back and shoot. You could make it the one with the fusion blaster as well, as you get one of those per 3 models still. In general, they look like nice cheap units to hold down the midfield and screen back the enemy, plus they're really quite nice as observers, as well as just having the potential for a marker drone. You can also grant your guided unit reroll 1s to wound as well, so one extra nice buff there. Overall seems usable. I probably wouldn't go too heavy though, it doesn't look like they're going to be primary damage dealers. Next up, we've got the Ghost Kill, who I think is kind of interesting with his new rules. 170 points and has gained a lot more toughness. Is up to toughness 8 and a 2 plus save, but perhaps more importantly has the lone operative keyword, which means that you just flat out can't shoot him outside of 12 inches. Just in case you needed yet more tankiness as well, twice per game you can use his drones to basically negate one failed save, make the damage output 0, and they're the ones that you'd want to save for some big melter hits or something like that, anything with enormous damage. For the weapons, out of the two I'd probably prefer the Ion Raker now. That one spits out 6 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. The Fusion Collider I think is significantly worse now, it's only got 18-inch range and it's lost a shot down to 2 rather than 3. Obviously still going to be very scary against tanks up close though. Otherwise the twin guns like the Riptide also lost a fair few shots due to being twin linked rather than getting double the shots, and overall it definitely feels like a suit that's still skewed to more durability than it is damage, but perhaps looks even more annoying to deal with now. You have to get even closer and it's arguably even tougher when you do so. Finally, for a support system you can either swap out the smoke keyword or the option to fall back and shoot. Both of them have advantages. Smoke's a great stratagem if you want yet more toughness, but I feel like this thing has probably got enough of that already. Next up, we've got the Tau Super Heavy in the Storm Surge. This great big walking battleship is 405 points, toughness 11, 20 wounds and a 2 plus save and a 4 plus invulnerable. Otherwise, it's a towering walker, so it won't be able to hide. If it needs to, it can move over smaller units like vehicles and things, and also small terrain features as well, provided they're not titanic as if they weren't there. It does only have an 8-inch move though. Finally, it does have an interesting explosion potential, d6 plus 2 damage. Ideally, you wouldn't want this thing to be shot down and explode in the middle of your Tau army. Weapons wise, it's got some interesting boosts built in. It gets one of those weapon support systems to allow it to ignore modifiers to the hit roll at ranged attacks, and as a Titan killer, it's extra good at killing enemy knights and things. Any titanic or towering foes it gets to re-roll the hit roll against may be very nice when you've got Kauyon and double exploding 6s. For the weapon profiles, I still feel like probably the scariest one is the Pulse Blast Cannon over the Driver. That one still has that truly ridiculous damage 12 shots within 24 inches, and still has a fair amount of pretty decent shooting out longer than that, but maybe not quite as much as the Driver. The Destroyer missiles are no longer limited fire, but you only get to fire 1 per turn now. They are up to damage d6 plus 2, so they're very scary as well. It's got a whole bunch of other supporting weapon systems, plus some cluster rockets that got strength 5 and AP 0 now. They got toned down a bit with AP, but get to hit on a +1 if it's still. The deploy anchors rule has kind of been rolled into the weapon keywords. It also gets a +1 to hit on just about everything as all of the guns gain heavy, so if you can keep it still for a turn it does hit a fair bit better. Overall looks solid enough for some heavy lifting, definitely won't go down without a fight and lots of focused anti-tank weapons. With its new profile though, I'd guess that for the point it's probably not going to be as hard to kill as things like the Riptide or the Ghost Kill for the points cost though. Next up we've got the Tau tanks and other vehicles. First up the Hammerhead gunship for 145 points, going up to toughness 10 now with the 10th edition vehicle changes and still keeping its 3+ save and 14 wounds. Like a fair few things in 40k as well, it has dropped a tiny bit in speed, down to movement 10 rather than 12. Weapons wise, the railgun's still fairly terrifying, but a lot more so if you don't have an invulnerable save. It no longer ignores invulnerable saves just at base, but you still get a very scary strength 20 shot with AP 5 and damage d6+6, and also devastating wounds if you happen to look out and roll a 6. That could be a whole ton of mortals there. It is heavy as well, so hits on a 3+ if you're stationary. Otherwise, the ion cannon still seems solidly generalist, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 on the overcharge. The new blast keyword might help that out a bit as well. And otherwise, the other guns seem to have been toned down a bit once more. Accelerator burst cannons have basically lost 4 shots each, but I still feel that they're probably the one to go for out of the secondary weapon systems, now that they cost the same as the rest and the smart missiles have been toned down. Tower vehicles are going to be mounting really quite a lot of Seeker missiles as well now though. You get 2 of them at strength 14, AP -3 and damage d6+1. Again, that's going to help a lot with the tank destroying roll. Finally for buffs, it gets a +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles. It wouldn't stack with the heavy under normal circumstances, but I guess that means that you can still have very good accuracy with a railgun on the move. And it's kept that rule where you now get to reroll 1 hit roll or 1 wound roll. Again, that's pretty excellent with the railgun. Makes it a lot more reliable and less likely to eat your command points by needing rerolls. Overall, I'd still say it looks interesting enough. I'd guess probably going to have a lot more competition from broadsides now though. Otherwise, we've also got the Skyray missile gunship as well. This one is actually more points than the Hammerhead now, 15 points more. Its base stat line is basically the same, and its primary weapon is the Seeker missile rack, 3 shots at the strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6+1. This one doesn't get bonus Seekers though. It gets the same targeting array rule as the Hammerhead for a single reroll, that's also very nice with those Seekers, and it's particularly adept at taking down fly units, rerolling the hit roll against them. Again, could be very nice with Kauyon and exploding 6s if you happen to look out and get a 6. Overall looks like some fairly solid anti-tank. I still feel like my money's probably on broadsides to win the anti-tank fight though. Will be interesting to see what people run the most. Finally for Hammerhead chassis, I thought it was worth mentioning Longstrike while we're here as well. He's 170, so a plus at 25 points over a regular Hammerhead, and basically he's an epic hero with a character keyword that's broadly the same as a regular Hammerhead. He gets 2 other buffs beyond that, a +1 to hit on the turret weapon only, plus also buffing 1 nearby Hammerhead with lethal hits. I feel like if you were taking 2 Hammerhead tanks, it's probably more worth making one of them Longstrike for that. The ballistic skill thing is still very nice, means that he's not as reliant on being guided perhaps, and getting a bit more value out of the second Hammerhead is rather nice. Moving on, we've got the Piranha, nice little cheap loot units at 55 points each here. They could be quite a good choice for marking targets with that for the greater good rule, but they just seem all around pretty efficient. Each Piranha now gets 2 Seeker missiles built into it, so it brings a very scary anti-tank alpha strike, and then can still whittle away with a bunch of pulse carbine shots and either burst cannons or fusion blasters later on. The Piranha fusion blaster has a bit more bite to it, that one gets melter 4 within 6 inches, so it's a bit more punchy if you can get it up close and score a wound. Otherwise it gained toughness 7, though it's still very easy to kill both with medium and high strength weapons, and it also has the Scout 9-inch keyword, so it's kind of interesting for a screening and disruption unit as well. Moving forward quite quickly with that big movement characteristic, and then could get some nice lines of sight with the Seeker missiles. Finally, beyond all that, they also hand out a single battle shock test in the movement phase within 12 inches. That's definitely a nice to have as well, and could mess with enemy stratagems. I feel like these things do bring really quite a lot to the table for 55 points. I feel like you'd rarely go wrong with taking 2 or 3 individual ones, and maybe more. Next up, we've got the Tau transport that is the Devilfish. Not a whole load of damage threats, but is fairly cheap and effective for the cost at 95 points. It is fairly tough with a toughness of 9, a 3+ save, and a big 13 wounds. It transports 12 models, so you can take a Fire Warrior squad, plus say an attached Fireblade. Kind of interesting to see that the accelerator burst cannon on this one is AP 0 when it was AP -1 on the Hammerhead though. I suspect they're supposed to be the same, not sure which one the main one's supposed to be. Again, this one also comes with 2 free Seeker missiles. Tau armies are going to have quite a lot of heavy anti-tank as an alpha strike early on, with all those Seekers hanging around. I feel like the Devilfish is going to be quite interesting just with the breaches, plus that nice stratagem that it's got for re-embarking within it. Maybe when it's dropping them off it can also spot for them as well, so they can hit on a 3+. If not though, it does also have the option for rapid deployment, advancing and then dropping the unit off. Might be needed if it's just the distance that's needed to get the squad onto an objective perhaps. Otherwise best to avoid if you can though, as you stop yourself shooting. Seems decent enough. I feel like the Devilfish plus the Breachers look like a fairly decent combo still, and they can still do their trick of scooting them up to objectives and jumping out. Next up we've got the Flyers with the Razor Shark Strike Fighter. This one's 165 points, a toughness of 10, and it's gained those new flyer rules. Broadly speaking, not amazingly good news for it. This one doesn't have the hover keyword, so it means that you have to start it off the board. It comes in from Strategic Reserve on round 2. Toughness 10 will be a big toughness boost to it, but it isn't going to be -1 to hit just innately anymore. That rule seems to have gone from Flyers. On the other hand though, that quad ion turret still seems to be at least fairly threatening. 8 shots with strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, and as well as keeping the 8 shots, it also seems to have kept twin linked for some reason. Most twin linked weapons have got half the shots, but this thing seems to have kept the same, but just picked up the reroll wounds keyword, which is all very nice. Otherwise, it's also got a ground strike fighter thing, +1 to hit ground targets. I guess doesn't hurt with the most of its guns. That is going to be a lot of models in the game. Not sure if it's quite got enough damage to really justify itself given the limitation of flyers. Definitely doesn't seem bad though. Fairly generalist firepower that's going to be a big threat to quite a lot of things out there. At first impressions I would say it's usable enough. Otherwise though, the Sunshark bombers also going to be contending with starting off the board, particularly because it means that their pulse bomb is really quite bad now. Previously you might have been bombing enemy units from turn 1, now the very earliest that you can possibly bomb enemy units is turn 3, as you need turn 2 to turn up, and then turn 3 hopefully fly over something and drop the bomb. Even then though, you might have your opponent have the chance to scurry their units out of the way, as flyers kind of have to declare their flight path now, and I feel like between all that, the scope of the bombing is really quite limited. Otherwise, beyond that, the guns aren't quite as impressive as the Razor Shark. It doesn't get the +1 to hit against ground targets, and doesn't have the marker-like keyword, even though it did in the past. Overall, I don't think that this one's worth saving the extra 15 points on. The Razor Shark just seems flat better. I did notice that there's perhaps a little bit of weirdness in the wording with the missile pods as well. Not really clear whether they're supposed to be a twin one or whether it's just 2 individual ones. It's kind of implied differently on the army construction side of the datasheet. Next up, we've got the Kroot Carnival squad. They went up in points slightly from 70 points to 75. I did kind of feel that they were a little bit on the expensive side when they'd gone up to 70 really. Despite being troops in the last codex, these are not battle line and they're only objective control 1, which is a little bit unfortunate for them. And for the most part they retain doing what they did before already, having scouts 7 inches to get them towards the midboard, but they have picked up a couple of special rules. Instead of their bonus to saves when they're in cover, they now have stealth instead. -1 to hit at range will probably be handy, and they can still potentially get cover saves. And then they get one of their stratagems just baked into the unit now. If they kill an enemy unit in melee, then their Grisly Feast with their cannibalism then gives them a 5+ feel no pain for the rest of the battle. Not impossible they could kill something, they do bring a decent amount of strength for AP0 volume attacks. In general it probably would have to be something that's fairly light, or didn't have many wounds left though. Tau do seem to have quite a lot of options for scout units. I guess these guys will be weighing themselves up against things like Pathfinders, Piranhas, and the other Kroot. Talking of which, the Kroot's Farstalkers are a new datasheet for the Codex. They're 12 models for 105 points. Definitely a bit more expensive than your standard Kroot mercenaries, but they do get a few more wounds baked in, I suppose. At base, the regular Farstalker has exactly the same stats as the regular Kroot. Their firearms have a different name, but are basically the same profile as the Kroot rifles, and it seems they hit the same in combat as well. It looks like a couple of their slightly more exotic weapons have been rolled into the general profile for those firearms. Looks like you no longer get different profiles for scatterguns or their sniper now. Otherwise for the units, they're infiltrators not scouts. One of them gets a Pekra to allow you to ignore cover at range, which is decent enough on AP0 volume fire. Their special weapons are a bit more limited now, you just get one of them to choose between either a Skinner or a Tribalast, either an AP-1 flamer, or sort of weird profile, high strength, and AP-1 anti-vehicle weapon, with a 4+ and devastating wounds. I think my first instinct would probably be to go towards the Flamer to synergize better with the rest of their weapons. I feel like you'd really want to stay still to outweigh the heavy keyword for the other thing. Finally, as bounty hunters, they get lethal hits and precision against one marked target at the start of the game. Could be kind of fun to think about them trying to assassinate a character with a bunch of AP0 shooting, and I guess they're interesting enough for putting some bodies on midfield objectives early on. Overall, I'd probably guess that they're just a little bit too expensive for the durability that they have, and the damage output's only really going to be all that good against light infantry, but I feel like having some infiltrators in the midfield might not be the worst idea. The role just might fall to the cheaper stealth suits though. Next, we've got the Kroot Rider, 35 points each, so up a big 10 points compared with previously. I feel like these guys have perhaps lost out quite a bit. As well as going up in cost, they've lost both attacks and AP on their combat weapons, and the Kroot gun itself is now AP0 now, where previously it was AP1. The special rule is that it gets a +1 to hit if it's near a carnivore squad, so I guess it'll be a little bit more accurate there. Even despite that and being a cheap scouting unit though, it does look at least somewhat awful. They won't exactly run a whole load before, and they've gone up quite a lot of points proportionately. Probably most interesting just for a very cheap unit actually with some objective control that can move into the midfield. Scouts maybe became a little bit less interesting for that, seeing as their objective control 0. Speaking of which, the Kroot Hounds are still usable. They're in 4 to 12 models at either 30, 60 or 90 points now. They move fast with the Beast keyword and still bring a few volume attacks at Strength 3, AP0 rather than AP1 though. As mentioned, I think the biggest change to these guys is that their objective control 0 means that random little screening units of them aren't in any danger of scoring objectives, which does limit their scope. Still could be kind of interesting for very cheap little nuisance screening units though. They could block deep strike, get in the way of enemy models moving forward, or potentially be even kind of interesting in combat against very light infantry that the enemy has, though I definitely don't think that damage output is the main thing that you'd take them for. Their special rule is called Hunting Pack. That one gives them a +1 to wound if they're nearby some Kroot carnivores. Realistically though, I feel like you don't generally take these for the damage. I'd treat that more as just a bit of a nice to have that won't come up too often. Overall still interesting, could help out for certain secondaries and things, as well as screening out the enemy. Finally for the Kroot units, we've got the Shaper. These are 50 points, so they went up quite a bit from 25. It can only lead the Kroot carnivores, not the Farstalkers. He's lost a wound and has lost a little bit of AP on the Ritual Blade, but he does have a fun rule called Ritualistic Feeding, where he gets +3 attacks on the charge, so 6 attacks rather than 3. His special rule is that he grants a 6+ Feel No Pain type ability to your Kroot mercenary units. Not awful, but kind of mediocre. It's not going to change them from being a fragile unit to a tough unit, and he does cost quite a lot to access that buff in the first place. Unless you have certain other rules to bring one of these, like maybe enhancements. He is locked out of most of those though, and he's probably just not really going to be worth bringing compared with just more Kroot, unless you're just going for a bit of a fun and fluffy Kroot army. Finally, for the auxiliaries, we've got the Vespid Stingwings. These are just 5 model units now, no more, no less, and I've got up to 75 points from 60, so that's a 15-point increase. Just in general, they really don't feel like they've changed all that much. The Neutron Blaster's lost a tiny bit of AP, but it's retained Assault. That's quite a nice benefit, seeing as quite a lot of things lost it. They still Deep Strike, and they've got a special rule that allows them to jump on and off the board at the end of your movement phase. Jumping off at the end of the movement phase is maybe a bit less exciting than going off at the end of the enemy turn, as a few other units do, as it does basically mean that they have a turn off the board not doing damage. Still could be pretty handy though for a reposition, particularly for trying to get to objectives or do secondaries maybe. Seem handy enough, and at least a reasonable threat to things like Space Marines with those blasters. Next up, we've got the trio of the Tau Fortifications, the Tide War Shield Line, and the Drone Port and Gun Rig. The Shield Line's 85 points, or +20 if you take the defense platform. That one basically just gives you more shield line, an extra 5 wounds, and turning the transport capacity up to 22 from 11, so basically double the amount of fire warriors that you can have inside it. The way that this works now is that it's both a vehicle and a fortification, toughness 8, a 3+ save, 10 wounds, and a 5+ invulnerable. Ideally, you'd have a unit of fire warriors on it, a shield line moving slowly up the board, and you'd be able to fire the pulse rifles and things out of it from a position of relative safety, due to it having the firing deck 20 special rule. Kind of interesting, means that the fire warriors would still be able to fire even if the unit got charged. I guess they would be -1 to hit though, as per the big guns never tire rule. This thing's also got some fortification type special rules as well. Even if the enemy charges you, you can still shoot their units in combat, and they can also fall back without worrying about desperate escape. Finally, it could also provide a bit of cover to the rest of your army as well, partially obscuring units to give them the benefit of cover. I guess just theoretically not the worst thing to have on the front line. Whether or not the entire proposition is really worth 85 points though is maybe a bit of a different question. It definitely doesn't look unusable, but there's quite a lot of disadvantages to firing out of transports. They can't use any of their special rules or abilities and things, and they won't be able to have any impact on objectives at all as well, as this has got OC0. I feel like it does look kind of fun to have a go with though. Otherwise, the drone port and the gun rig operate pretty much in the same way, but just swap out the invulnerable save for other benefits. The drone port is also 85 points, that one just transports 11, and basically has the same stats but no invulnerable save, and trades that out for an extra bunch of drone shooting, 8 attacks hitting on 5s at strength 5 with twin links. Definitely not awful, but maybe feels like the weakest of the three perhaps, neither particularly scary shooting nor the invulnerable save. Finally, for the Tide War, we've also got the gun rig, basically the great big railgun mounted on one of the transport type things. This one's 90 points, so is a tiny bit more, has the same transport capacity thing and the big firing deck. Instead of a few gun drones though, this mounts literally a massive railgun that you'd find on a hammerhead, and has even twin links. Unfortunately, they've decided to entrust it to a drone to fire it, so it'll only hit on a 5+, very unreliable for actually doing any damage, but if you do get lucky and a shot hits home with this, it hits at strength 20, AP -5 and damage d6 plus 6 with devastating wounds and re-rolling the wound roll to boot. I feel like this one's really quite tempting versus the invulnerable save of the shield line. I think I'd rather take it over the drone port, feels like a lot more likely to actually have a major impact on the game, even if there are some games that it just misses all the time. Finally, we get to the Tau characters, and first up we've got the Battlesuit ones, then we'll go through Ethereals, and then the Infantry characters. I'll talk through the epic heroes at the same time as their class. First up, we've got the Commander in Crisis Battlesuit, 110 points. He's really quite a lot cheaper than he used to be, given that basically all of his gear comes paid for in that. Overall, he is going to be less threatening and do less buffs though, so it's all a bit of a trade-off. He can only lead Crisis Battlesuits, he's not going to be doing anything good for broadsides in the new index, and while he's got a fairly similar stat line, he's lost a wound, can't take an Iridium suit, and hits on a 3+ rather than a 2+, so he's perhaps not quite as ridiculously good or resistant to modifiers there, and can actually have some good use out of that for the greater good rule. Otherwise, he comes with 2 drones baked in. I feel like on more valuable characters, perhaps the value of the shield drones go up. You could have him up to 7 wounds if you'd like. And then for his weapons and support systems, you get to mix and match any 4 weapons out of the standard crisis ones, and he can give up a hardpoint weapon for a support system should you wish to. Again, kind of interesting that they can go super dedicated if you like them to now. Could be having 12 cyclic ion blaster shots, hitting on a 3+ if you wanted to risk the big overcharges, or maybe 4 shots with plasma rifles, or 8 missile pod launchers. In general, Crisis Commanders aren't going to be quite as godly in terms of damage output without the layered buffs that you can put on them, between the relics, signature systems, and the big rerolls from the precision trait. In terms of buffs for leading the unit, it's maybe not enormously exciting, simply reroll ones to hit for the squad, usually going to be a 17% damage boost. It's not nothing, but it's also not spectacular. I guess at least it would apply to his own attacks now, seeing as he would be in the unit. Overall seems alright to put into a crisis suit squad, could be one way that you could get an enhancement in there, doesn't seem absolutely stand out remarkable though. Otherwise, for Crisis Commander options, you've got the Enforcer Battlesuit one. He's got a quite significantly higher points cost and has less move but a better save and more wounds. His special rule is a durability buff for the Crisis suits, making AP -1 worse against them if they're targeted by enemy guns. My guess is that quite a lot of them might want to be running shield generators anyway, and that is going to be a bit less relevant for those guys as it only matters against AP -1 mostly. I guess if you are running a crisis unit with the weapon or the battlesuit support systems though, then his value goes up. Overall, not enormously enthused by this guy. The AP thing is quite nice, but I'm just not sure it's so much more nice that you pay 25 points more than the regular Crisis Commander. Finally, we've got the Cold Star Commander, who I think is a bit more interesting. He's 125 points, so is between the two there. And again, he gets basically the same weapon options, but also the choice of a high output burst cannon. That's now 8 shots at strength 5, AP 0, losing some shots and AP. Still looks like it's worth it though, probably more value in that than most of the other guns. His special rule is that he gets a 12-inch move, and he confers that same 12-inch move to the Crisis Battlesuit unit, and also helpfully hands out the assault keywords to all the other weapons in his squad. That's really quite nice, I think, particularly given that the crisis suits get their auto advance of 6 inches built in. Means that crisis suits led by a cold style will be moving 18 inches and still be able to fire, and they could even use their strike and phase type rule after that to potentially move another 12 inches somewhere else. Overall, pretty powerful movement shenanigans. I feel like that could be a pretty reasonable option to trade out for the reroll ones. Next up though, we've got the Commander of the Tau Sept in Commander Shadowsun herself, 140 points and must be a Warlord if she is present, though I feel like she is going to crop up in really quite a lot of lists. For her points cost, just seems like one of the better datasheets out of the entire codex. Stats wise, she's -1 wound and -1 toughness, her drones have been merged with her main profile, but she does have stealth for a -1 to hit, lone operative so she can't get targeted too close, and she's also -1 to wound at range as well, which is quite a nice debuff. For her personal weapons, she strikes with that flechette launcher, but mainly those high energy fusion blasters. 2 shots at a bigger strength 10, AP -4 and damage D6, and these ones are longer range than the regular fusion blasters still, but just in general with melting weapons getting shorter range, they're down to 18 inches. The strength 10 is very nice though, that'll definitely be relevant against light to medium vehicles. I feel like all of that's quite a good start. Lone Operative's very disruptive, and the fusion blasters are good. Perhaps the best things for her though are her aura buffs. She gets an aura of reroll hit rolls of 1 to any units within 6 inches. Pretty nice that one, and much better than the Crisis Commanders one, as this could affect all sorts of units nearby, perhaps even multiple units of Crisis suits, or some really big scary tanks or vehicles. I guess the broadsides would quite enjoy that. On top of that, if you happen to be using stratagems on any units nearby, you get a 5+ chance to refund a command point if you use one on a unit within 6 inches. If she is going to be at the core of your army and buffing a lot of units with those rerolls, that's quite likely going to be good for a command point or two over the course of the game. Overall for a leader seems really quite solid. The captain style reroll aura is quite a big deal in 10th, and she does get pretty decent shooting with those fusion blasters. She'll even reroll the ones to hit herself with them. Otherwise, you've got the option of Commander Farsight, 120 points, and a little bit cheaper than before. Again, he leads the Crisis Battlesuits, and like a fair few of the units, a few of his stats have gone down a bit. -1 wound, the rifle has lost 12-inch range, and the Dawnblade has lost 1 attack and a pip of AP. It's perhaps not the worst news in the world for the Dawnblade though, as once per game he'll have much better combat than that would be normally, as he gets to use aggressive offensive and gets to reroll all hits and wounds with that fairly general purpose weapon. His damage boost is Wave the Short Blade. This one gives your units a +1 to wound within 9 inches of the enemy. A very powerful boost that one, and certainly one that would be meaningful if you can trigger it. I feel like the issue is that you just need to try and make sure that you can trigger it. Wouldn't work out of Deep Strike, and particularly with the new flying vehicle rules not allowing you to jump over ruins, I feel like it's going to be a bit harder to coordinate getting in safely with that. Perhaps the other pretty interesting thing about him is that he gets weirdly great tank shock. There's nothing in the core rules that stop him using it as basically a vehicle, and with the Dawnblade being strength 10, that means he'd be rolling around 10 dice or more to try and get those mortal wounds, a very reasonable chance of him hitting the max 6 mortal wound cap for 1 CP. Definitely a good example of that stratagem acting rather weirdly, but unless they decide to FAQ it or anything, I guess that means he gets a massive buff to mortal wounds, and that's one of the best ways that you can spend a command point in the Tau army, I suspect. Overall, I still think he seems nice enough. I feel like that damage buff is just a little bit on the frustrating side though. If it was 12 inches, it'd be so much better, just jumping out of Deep Strike and reliably getting his rule off. In contention with Farsight though are the Ethereals. Either you get to choose to run Ethereals in your army or Farsight, you can't have both, so I guess that will be an army construction choice there, and a bit of a choice between the Enclaves and the main Empire. A standard Ethereal is 50 points and can attach to either the Strike or Breacher team, just leading the Strike teams now, so not hovering alongside Battlesuits. He comes with the drones attached as well, so he can take 2 drones from the standard 3. His personal stats are maybe a little bit side graded. He's lost a wound, and his Honor Stave doesn't really do as much in close combat anymore. Not that it was particularly awesome before, but it did a bit. He has gained a 5+ invulnerable save though, so maybe just a tiny bit harder to kill with enemy sniping. He's leadership 6+, which he grants to his unit, and otherwise he's got 2 rather nice buffing special rules, a 5+ feel no pain to your Breacher squad or strike team, quite a meaningful durability boost there, and also if you can keep him alive turn on turn, each command phase you roll a dice, and on a 4+ you get a command point. On average, that's generally going to be good for 2 or 3 command points over the course of the game if you can have him survive the battle. I feel like that's a decent start towards getting him towards that 50 points worth of value. Maybe the extra leadership and extra durability for the strike squad team could be worth the rest. Otherwise for Ethereals, we've got Ornshi, a bit of a weird unit this one, 3 models for 65 points, and interestingly lone operative so you can't shoot them very easily, and then 2 different rules that make them just massively tanky even if you can. On the flip side though, they just do kind of surprisingly little for your army. They simply get an aura of +1 to your battle shock and leadership tests, which definitely isn't nothing, but at the same time it's not enormous. You can still absolutely fail battle shock on a leadership of a 6+, and again, it does tend to be a little bit on the situational side in the first place. You have to have a unit injured below half strength and not killed, and most of the things that hand out battle shock in the enemy turn generally will only mess with you using stratagems and things, which might not necessarily be all that important by the time they're doing the damage. When it gets back to your own turn, it heals again basically, so it wouldn't matter for things like objective control and falling back, unless your units were actually depleted and failed one then. Weirdly enough, I feel like Ornvar might actually be most interesting for a massively tanky roadblock, or just to sit on a far-flung objective that your opponent can't reach with lone operative. His defensive stats are rather good, only toughness 3 but -1 to hit and to wound. They've got a 4+ invulnerable save, and then once per game you get a single phase of having a 2+ invulnerable save as well. Even big units stacking a whole bunch of attacks might struggle to wipe out Ornvar if he's got that up. He does have 9 wounds between himself and his guards. Finally for the Ethereals, we've got Ornshi, the duelist Ethereal from Viola. As with Farsight and Shadowsun though, and quite a lot of armies in 40k though, you can freely mix and match them between armies. They don't have to be part of the same sept, so you can still say have Ornshi and Longstrike and Shadowsun. Ornshi can lead the Breacher and Strike teams once more, but perhaps more interestingly Kroot Carnivores. He's had similar sort of stat line changes to the Ethereals, but has some fairly decent melee. 6 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 with sustained hits, and then a choice of 3 different buffing rules from Martial Warrior, either precision, devastating wounds, or sustained hits too. Still not going to be taking down entire squads of things, but alright against light to medium infantry. On top of that, you also get Inspirational Defiance. This one gives you +1 to your objective control characteristic of your units, and I feel like between those 2 buffs is probably most interesting for Kroot. They at least have a little bit of combat threat already, so his goes kind of alright with them, plus they really like the extra objective control as well, only having 1. I guess he doesn't have Scout though, so he might stop the squad from doing that. A bit of a trade-off with them getting into the midfield nice and early. I did find his leadership 7 a little bit surprising as well for Ethereal. Kind of weird that he and Ornvar have leadership 7 despite being basically the leadership buffing characters, and the regular Ethereal has 6. Finally, to round up, we've got a few more infantry characters. The Cadre Fireblade is 50 points, he gets the drones included, and he can lead either a breacher team or a strike team. For his personal stats, he's been toned down a little bit for the most part. He's lost AP -2 on his gun, though he does have a nice rule that gives him AP 3 on critical wounds, a little bit of a chance for that AP to come back, I suppose. And I did notice that despite having the chance to have a marker light on the model and stuff, he doesn't actually get the marker light keyword unless you take a marker drone along now. His main buff is going to be the same as normal, +1 attack to ranged weapons, so usually either a 50% increase at half range, or double damage for your strike team firing at 30 inches. Perhaps could be interesting enough in combined with that Overwatch stratagem for the strike team, getting quite a lot of shots on a 4+, perhaps. He does seem like an interesting one to bear that through Unity Devastation enhancement as well. Maybe sit him at the back with some strike team with a good line of sight, and then hand out that debuff when you're buffing another unit. Next, we've got the Firesight Marksman and Sniper Drones, now just called a Firesight team. They're 70 points and basically count as one model's profile now. One single model at toughness 3, a 4+ save and 4 wounds. He gets lone operative, infiltrators and stealth. Perhaps not really a guy that you want on the very front line, but could be interesting enough to set up in tall buildings maybe. That could get him some extra AP with the sniper rifles, and also could be a good line of sight for him guiding units, as he seems fairly well adept to guiding things being fairly cheap, plus having the marker light keyword as well. The sniper rifles still look interesting enough. The drones all hit on a 3+ with a heavy keyword, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2. At least some chance of sniping some cheaper support characters, I suppose. His special rule is that if this unit gets guided, then each time it makes an attack on the target, then you get to re-roll the hit roll with those drones. Maybe not terrible, but just seems a little bit redundant, as I guess they'd be up to ballistic skill 2+ at that point, so I guess that only really equates to reroll 1s to hit. In general, I'd probably largely ignore that rule and just use him to guide other units rather than being guided himself. Sit in the open, can't be shot, guide other units, and chip in a little bit of sniper fire. Finally, lastly we have Darkstrider, 75 points now, so a little bit more expensive. I do feel like his buffs have got a lot less good. He leads the Pathfinder team, and his main thing is that he gives them +1 to wound. Not too bad with all the ion weapons, I suppose, but I feel at 75 points you're getting to the point where you could probably just be taking more Pathfinders. Otherwise, his Pulse Carbine isn't really quite as interesting. It's lost AP 2 all the way down to AP 0, so even with damage 2 it's not going to be that threatening most of the time. He does have a special rule that gives you a screen of 12 inches against deep strikers though. Not really all that bad to have on objectives, but I feel like if you're doing that with Pathfinders, then you've got a very expensive unit on objectives there, 200 points worth of models that are really quite easy to kill. Overall seems like a bit of a tough sell to me at 75 points. I guess if you did take him though, his Pathfinder team would genuinely hit very hard. The special weapon profiles are quite nice. So with characters done, that brings us to the end of Index Tau Empire. Really quite a lot of shifting around there. I do feel like quite a lot of the guns have been toned down a bit, and perhaps the buffs that they can access, particularly for crisis suits and commanders and things, have generally tended to be reduced as well. It'll be interesting to see what sort of things people make out of this. I still feel like a big unit of crisis suits could be pretty viable, particularly jump shoot jumping to keep safe. With a loss of a whole load of ablative drones, I do feel like they're a unit that's a bit easier to kill these days. Otherwise, broadsides seem kind of nice. Ghost kills look quite disruptive, even if they're not the biggest damage dealers in the world. And piranhas with seeker missiles look like they're excellent value for what they bring to the table. Otherwise, stealth suits seem usable for screening out the enemy. Devilfish and breachers could be good to get some objective control points into the midboard. And for characters, I both really quite like Shadow Sun and Farsight really. Or perhaps just a cheap 50-point Ethereal in a strike team unit. Farming a few command points and making them a bit tougher seems a reasonable enough combination of things they can do. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes on all the new stats and rules though. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. It is the thing that allows me to keep on making these videos full time. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.